Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and I'm going to tell you a story. This one comes from Mike Truman, who was on the mountain in 1996 with Malcolm Duff's expedition. Duff's team assisted with the rescue efforts lower down, and Truman assisted primarily in base camp with coordination efforts. But that is not the story I'm here to tell you. This story is about what happened after Truman got back home to Hong Kong, where he worked as a corporate communications manager for a shipping company. This picks up where he starts sorting through the large pile of mail that had accumulated while he was on his Everest expedition. Someone had sent me a postcard, which was welcome change from both the serious and routine mail. I glanced at the picture on the front, and without fully comprehending which mountain it showed, I idly flipped it over. Was this some joke? There was Rob Hall's signature staring back at me. But Rob was dead, and his body was lying somewhere near the summit of Everest. 3 members of his team had also died on our side of Everest, along with other expedition leader, Scott Fisher. The message was brief. It stated, actually boasted, that Rob Hall's commercial climbing company, Adventure Consultants, had been successful yet again in guiding clients to the top of the world. It went on to encourage the reader of the postcard to join Adventure Consultants if they wanted to achieve success on future expeditions. It was obviously not a joke, and my emotions simmered, then boiled into anger. How could anyone be so crass? People die climbing Everest, but here was a company so confident that they would achieve success that they had pre-written postcards to advertise the feat to encourage others to join them on future expeditions. I was particularly incensed that the postcard had been sent in the brief time between Rob getting to the top and him becoming trapped with his client, Doug Hansen, not far below the summit. Was it so necessary and vital to get such news out so quickly, considering the time it would take the world's postal system to deliver the cards? Now, you can be sure that if Sandy Pittman had performed such a stunt, it would have been all we would have heard about for the past 29 years. But beyond being a rather macabre faux pas on the part of Adventure Consultants, the postcard It's Not Smoking Ice Axe proving Krakauer's account is complete fiction. That would be page 278 of Michael Groom's Sheer Will, where it says Adventure Consultants waited at South Summit at Rob Hall's instructions, and not because of a lack of fixed ropes. And Charlotte Fox's article in the American Alpine Journal stating that Mountain Madness waited for over an hour at South Summit for their oxygen to arrive, and thus even if the ropes were fixed in advance, they would not have moved without the oxygen. There's the admission that Krakauer falsified his time at the base of the Hillary Step. Krakauer claims this was inadvertent. There's the admission that Krakauer falsified the Montenegrins running out of fixed ropes. Krakauer admits this was deliberate, but he says it was presumptuous on his part, as if that somehow excuses it. There's the admission that Sandy Pittman was not grabbed by the harness just below the summit. Krakauer blames that one on Beitelman supposedly giving him incorrect information, with no explanation as to how Krakauer managed to get it correct in the 1996 article, but got it wrong in his 1997 book. There's Krakauer admitting in 2016 that there was oxygen bottle theft on South Summit, though he's walked that back slightly in his 2025 chapters. There's also Krakauer being quoted in 2016 as admitting that he, quote, publicly falsified the story of Into Thin Air. Now in 2025, Krakauer denied ever having said that. But to that reporter's credit, the story has not been taken down, nor has any correction been issued. And of course, Krakauer's admission, 29 years late, that all the deaths on Adventure Consultants' team could likely have been avoided if Rob Hall had simply let Doug Hansen continue his descent to South Col when Hansen had already made the decision early in the morning to turn around. And those are just the smoking ice axes that go to the fundamental nature that the work is a fictional invention rather than factual reporting. There are numerous other mistakes, errors, omissions that continue to come up, and the more explanation and excuses Krakauer offers, the worse it gets. But as Krakauer has thanked me so profusely for pointing out these errors, I will continue to document them so he can make the corrections in the upcoming revision to his book, which he stated will be out in April of 2026. Rather than factually reporting on the events around May 10, 1996, Krakauer's article, and later his book, are full of innuendo, misdirection, and outright fabrications, focusing the discussion on Bukriv's not using supplemental oxygen and Lobsang supposedly being exhausted from pulling Sandy Pittman up the mountain. The question at this point is, why does Krakauer's ever-changing version of events always favor Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants and shift the blame onto Scott Fisher's team, namely Anatoly Bukriv, Lobsang Jangbu, and Sandy Pittman? Krakauer's fabrications in favor of Rob Hall can best be seen in this passage, which appears both in the 1996 article and the 1997 book. From the beginning, Hall had planned that May 10th would be our summit day. Of the 4 times I've summited, he explained, twice it was on the 10th of May. As the Sherpas put it, the 10th is an auspicious date for me. But there was also a more down-to-earth reason for selecting this date. The annual ebb and flow of the monsoon made it likely that the most favorable weather of the year would fall on or near May 10th. It should go without saying that the weather was a key factor in the events of May 10th. And while Graham Ratcliffe's book, A Day to Die For, makes additional claims that there were some weather reports that I have not been able to verify, here I am just going to stick to Krakauer's statement because it demonstrates how he fabricates things to cover for Rob Hall. What Rob Hall actually said is that he picked May 10th based on what he thought was a lucky day. At no point in any of Krakauer's narrative, on this page or anywhere else, does Rob Hall say he evaluated weather reports and picked the date based on some meteorological analysis. Rather than just leave it at that factual reporting, Krakauer then inserts. But there was also a more down-to-earth reason for selecting this date. The annual ebb and flow of the monsoon made it likely that the most favorable weather of the year would fall on or near May 10th. Krakauer provides no source for this, likely because none exist. Nor does he say that Rob Hall had access to this information or used it in any way in his decision process. Krakauer just states as scientific fact that weather patterns favor early May. Even in the 29 years since 1996, with numerous weather studies about Mount Everest, none have concluded that early May is more favorable, but rather note that late May is more popular for modern expeditions, with May 23rd being the historical date for the most summits of Everest. However, back in 1996, few if any studies had been conducted on the weather on Mount Everest, and the weather stations on which accurate analysis has been performed in recent years were not in place at that time. Krakauer made a key scientific statement reported as fact for which he provides no citation and for which no supporting study exists. It appears that Krakauer's statement that Hall's decision to go on May 10th, and that just happened to match up with the science, was fabricated out of thin air. So that was an example of something Krakauer either completely invented or at the very least failed to provide even a hint that could be used to verify his extraordinary claim. Now let's look at a key incident that Krakauer left out of both his article and his book while pushing the blame onto supposedly inexperienced climbers and away from Rob Hall. First, let's look at what Krakauer wrote about Jaakko Namba's supposed technical deficiencies. Several times both Beck and Jaakko had appeared to be in danger of falling off a ladder and plummeting into a crevasse, and Jaakko seemed to know next to nothing about how to use crampons. Andy, who revealed himself to be a gifted, extremely patient teacher, and who as the junior guide had been assigned to climbing with the slowest climbers at the rear, spent the whole morning coaching her on basic ice climbing techniques. And Krakauer further explains in a footnote, although Jaakko had used crampons previously in her climbs of Aconcagua, McKinley, that's Denali, Elbrus, and Vinson, none of these ascents involved much, if any, true ice climbing. The terrain in each case consisted primarily of relatively gentle slopes of snow and or gravel-like scree. First, it should be noted that Krakauer states he had never climbed higher than 17,200 feet prior to Everest, which rules out him having climbed Aconcagua, Denali, or Elbrus. He did head to Antarctica in 1996 after his book was finished, but he had apparently not climbed any of those higher routes for which he professed such knowledge in his book. Jaakko Namba, as well as Sandy Pittman, Lena Gammelgard, and Charla Fox, every single one of the women on the two teams had all climbed higher than Krakauer prior to 1996, and with the possible exception of John Taskey, every single person on Adventure Consultants had climbed higher than Krakauer prior to 1996. So Krakauer had extensive low-altitude ice climbing experience, and yet he informs us that all this ice climbing experience is irrelevant. Although I'd never been in an ice fall as frightening as the Khumbu, I've climbed many other ice falls. They typically have vertical or even overhanging passages that demand considerable expertise with ice axe and crampons. There was certainly no lack of steep ice in the Khumbu ice fall, but all of it had been rigged with ladders or ropes or both, rendering the conventional tools and techniques of ice climbing largely superfluous. So Krakauer spent 184 words that tells that Jaakko didn't have extensive ice climbing skills, but that ultimately such ice climbing skills are largely irrelevant on Mount Everest. Krakauer also leaves out that numerous people work on their ice climbing skills in the lower camps because there is nothing else to do, and many people find it fun just to do some ice climbing while they acclimatize. Jaakko isn't here to tell us if she was doing this, nor is Andy Harris here to give us his assessment of Jaakko's ice climbing skills. We just have to take John Krakauer's word for it. Krakauer told us that such ice-climbing skills were superfluous, so other than to berate Jasko, it is not clear what the relevance of any of this was. In contrast, in terms of receiving remedial instruction, Krakauer left out the following, which was reported by Michael Groom in Sheer Will. As a guide, I would be using oxygen, a foreign experience to me, so much so that I was embarrassed to admit I could not screw a regulator into an oxygen bottle. Rob had to show me in the privacy of our mess tent. So we have a detailed story about Jasko Namba supposedly lacking ice skills that Krakauer himself labels as superfluous, while completely missing from Krakauer's account is any reference to Rob Hall giving instructions to Michael Groom on how to attach a regulator to a bottle, a highly useful skill that needs to be perfected over time so that you can do it under the most extreme conditions, at altitude, in freezing conditions, without oxygen, and wearing heavy mittens. Krakauer also fails to mention that this can be a rather delicate task and that oxygen is venting into the atmosphere for as long as it takes to get a seal on the bottle. This also demonstrates that Groom didn't have any experience with oxygen systems prior to this expedition, which would prove critical in the events at South Summit, where he believed he was giving Krakauer and Namba full oxygen bottles, when, in fact, Krakauer was only about a third full, and Jasko slightly less. But are all these mistakes, omissions, and fabrications just a series of honest mistakes, or are they part of a larger pattern? It turns out they are part of a larger pattern. Far from being a journalistic telling of the events, Krakauer's article in Outside Magazine and his book routinely promote Rob Hall's adventure consultants, including blatant puff pieces copy and pasted directly from adventure consultants' advertising brochures. This should come as no surprise. Krakauer was not on a journalistic assignment. Outside Magazine is not a news magazine, and they had an extensive advertising agreement with Rob Hall's adventure consultants, which I will get into shortly. I will delve into the numerous other violations of journalistic ethics committed by Krakauer in a future video, but for now I will simply introduce the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics as it existed in 1996. Now, Krakauer was under no obligation to follow any of these, nor is the word journalist formally defined to strictly mean someone who adheres to basic standards of fairness and accuracy. However, I will use the word journalist to mean somebody who at least attempts to adhere to these basic standards, for which Krakauer falls far short. A core piece of the SPJ's Code of Ethics is to, quote, act independently, avoid conflicts of interest, real or perceived, and refuse gifts, favors, free travel, and special treatment. First, let's look at what we know about the deal between Rob Hall's adventure consultants and Outside Magazine. Still, after 29 years, the exact terms remain secret. Adventure consultants and Outside Magazine could release the full agreement to clear up what the terms and obligations were. For now, we can piece together the following from Krakauer's book. A typical slot on adventure consultants cost about $65,000, of which $10,000 went directly to the Nepalese government for the permit fee. Scott Fisher initially pitched the idea of Krakauer going to Everest after Fisher successfully climbed Everest in 1994. Here's how Krakauer portrays Fisher's role in getting Krakauer to go to Everest. Scott had piqued my interest, more even than he probably realized, and he was relentless. He talked up Everest every time he saw me and repeatedly harangued Brad Welzer, an editor at Outside, about the idea. By January 1996, thanks in no small part to Fisher's concerted lobbying, the magazine made a firm commitment to send me to Everest, probably, Welzer indicated, as a member of Fisher's expedition. In Scott's mind, it was a done deal. A month before my scheduled departure, however, I got a call from Welzer saying there'd been a change in plans. Rob Hall had offered the magazine a significantly better deal, so Welzer proposed that I join the Adventure Consultants expedition instead of Fisher's. At some point in January, Fisher became aware that Krakauer would be going with Rob Hall, and he had a conversation with Krakauer. In January, when Fisher found out that Hall had won me away from his team, he was apoplectic. He called me from Colorado, as upset I'd ever heard him, to insist that he wasn't about to concede victory to Hall. Like Hall, Fisher didn't bother trying to hide the fact that it wasn't me he was interested in, but rather the collateral publicity and advertising. In the end, however, he was unwilling to match Hall's offer to the magazine. From Krakauer's account, Fisher originated the idea and did most of the work to make it happen, only to be told in January that Krakauer would be going with Hall because, in Krakauer's own words, Rob Hall had offered the magazine a significantly better deal. Krakauer also writes that in January, the selection of Rob Hall was not a done deal. Had Fisher agreed to match the deal, Krakauer's original account strongly implies, if not outright says, that he would have climbed with Fisher. Buchrev's account in The Climb describes a little more of the early negotiations between Mountain Madness and Outside Magazine. Negotiations went well, and Fisher was excited about the potential relationship. In exchange for a discounted price to Outside, Mountain Madness was lobbying for advertising space and a feature story, replete with color photos that they hoped would contain precious promotional prose. Krakauer was enthusiastic too, telling one of Fisher's associates that he wanted to climb with Scott's team because Scott's team actually had better climbers, and that Scott was a local guy and an interesting character. It is not clear what the phrase that they hoped would contain precious promotional prose meant. Krakauer is adamant that whatever the secret deal ultimately inked between Adventure Consultants and Outside Magazine was, it did not require Outside to include positive spin in the article. So this is a good time to look at what Krakauer's version is 29 years later. First, Krakauer's account in his Chapter 2 from 2025. Here is the overarching lie. Tracy claims Rob Hall entered into an agreement with Outside stipulating that Hall would pay Outside for me to join Rob Hall's 1996 expedition, and in return, Outside would publish a promotional article written by me extolling Hall's commercial guiding business, Adventure Consultants. Now, Krakauer does not quote any section of any video where I claim that Rob Hall paid Outside Magazine for the so-called stipulation. As with anyone on YouTube, if they don't provide you a source, then it didn't happen. Krakauer then goes on to explain some of the secretive terms using rather vague language. Hall did not pay Outside to have me write an article that would promote Adventure Consultants' business interests. As the excerpt above explains, Hall agreed to let me join his expedition as a journalist if Outside paid his company in the form of credit for future advertising worth approximately $55,000 plus $10,000 in cash to cover the cost of what the government of Nepal charged for my climbing permit. I wasn't a non-paying client, as Tracy alleges. Most of the payment to Hall was simply in the form of valuable future advertising. Krakauer goes on to claim, Outside made it explicitly clear to Hall that the article I would write about the expedition would be fair and unbiased, and that my assignment was to report truthfully about whatever I experienced regardless of the expedition's outcome. Like most reputable magazines, Outside had a firewall between the editorial side of the operation and the business side. Advertisers understood that purchasing ads did not include a guarantee of favorable reporting in the magazine. But this agreement went far beyond purchasing ads, and if Krakauer wants to assure us about what the agreement provided, the best thing he can do is convince Outside and Adventure Consultants to release the agreement. Until then, we have Buchrev's account of the negotiations with Mountain Madness that make it clear that Scott Fisher had at least hoped that Outside would give them preferential treatment, and they had discussed the use of the color photos. Obviously, having photos of your guide and not having photos of the other team is clearly promotional, even if it isn't explicitly saying so. Now, there was a disaster, and other than Adventure Consultants sending some ill-timed postcards, any other ideas of writing a completely promotional piece did not materialize. Parties to a contract are permitted to mutually modify it, and typically do so when a major disaster would negatively impact glowing promotional photos of Rob Hall leading his team up the mountain. Krakauer then contends, furthermore, neither the article I ended up writing for Outside nor my book could be considered promotional in any reasonable understanding of the term. To the contrary, my reporting exposed how a number of bad decisions Hall made during the expedition were directly or indirectly responsible for the 1996 disaster. And while Krakauer assures us that the deal did not require favorable treatment, this vastly misunderstands how influence works. No one walks up to a politician and says, I will donate $1 million to your campaign if you will pardon my brother. Let's draft up a contract and put it all in writing. That is not the way influence works. There is no need for an explicit agreement when the interests are structured to coincide. For instance, the agreement could have provided that if Adventure Consultants' Everest business doubled in size, then the amount of advertising they utilized in Outside Magazine would also double. Buchrev reported that photos of the selected expedition would be featured in the article, which is a great way to provide indirect promotion without explicitly requiring that the article include promotional language. More problematic is Krakauer's claim that Hall had no difficulty in finding clients. If that were true, Hall could have simply taken on a different paying client, collected their cold, hard cash, and used that to purchase the $55,000 in outside magazine advertising space. The sunken cost, oxygen, food, Sherpa support would have been the same for Krakauer as for any other client. Nor does Krakauer explain why Scott Fisher was so upset by the switch. If Krakauer were merely a neutral journalist writing a fair and balanced article covering all commercial expeditions equally, then why would it matter which team he climbed with? Why would Fisher care, unless Krakauer's presence came with some exclusivity, access, or exposure that was never offered to the other teams? This strongly suggests that the deal between Hall and Outside involved more than Krakauer has publicly admitted, something closer to a promotional partnership than an arm's-length editorial assignment. At least Lou Kosiski felt that way. In his book, After the Wind, Kosiski writes, Rob was casual about the issue and said John is only going to climb Everest and write a story about his experience. That sounded simple enough, but it didn't fool anybody. We all knew Rob viewed John as paid, hired help to crank up publicity for Rob and his expedition business. In the alliance with Outside Magazine, Rob fronted most of the cash in exchange for John's story and discounted future ad space. Rather than providing any actual evidence that there was no preferential treatment, no exclusive interviews, no prominent placement of Rob Hall in photographs, no extra narrative focus, and no editorial bias in coverage, Krakauer simply assures us that he and Outside Magazine investigated themselves and found they did nothing wrong. Krakauer's bias toward Rob Hall and Adventure Consultants is especially visible in the promotional material that makes its way directly into the text of Into Thin Air. On page 38, Krakauer writes, between 1990 and 1995, Hall was responsible for putting 39 climbers on the summit of Everest. That sentence appears to be a cleaned-up version of Adventure Consultants' own marketing language, which is reprinted in Into Thin Air, the illustrated edition. One ad boasts, we are the world leaders in Everest-guided climbs, 39 people on top since 1990. Another asks readers to guess which company, quote, has now placed a world record tally of 39 people on top of Everest, and, quote, will give you the best chance of reaching the top. Krakauer's phrasing in the book directly mirrors this claim, though softened with more ambiguous phrase, responsible for. But how accurate is it? Using the Himalayan database, it's easy to verify that the 39 summit figures includes repeated ascents by the same individuals. Rob Hall himself is counted 4 times. His co-founder Gary Ball is counted twice. His guides Ed Viester and Guy Cotter are also included. Most notably, the total includes 13 summits by Sherpa, whom Hall certainly did not guide. If anything, they were the ones supporting his ascents. Even more misleading is the inclusion of 6 summits from 1990, including that of Peter Hillary, the son of Edmund Hillary. Peter Hillary summited as part of the New Zealand International Everest Expedition, not a commercial climb with Adventure Consultants, as Adventure Consultants would not even be formed until 1991. In short, the 39 Summits talking point was always advertising puffery, but Krakauer repackages it in language that sounds neutral and fact-checked. Hall was responsible for putting 39 climbers on the summit, and it worked. In her more academically focused book, False Summit, Julie Rock was misled by Krakauer's puffery, in that she wrote, between 1990 and 1995, 39 of his clients summited Mount Everest. But that is not what Krakauer actually said. He said climbers, not clients. He said responsible for putting, not guided. This is textbook classic Krakauer, a statement that is technically true, but so vaguely phrased that it misleads both casual readers and careful scholars. The number of paying commercial clients Hall got to the summit between 1990 and 1995 is 14. Another 4 paid but didn't summit, giving him a client success rate of 77%, a figure that appears nowhere in Krakauer's book. And purely coincidentally, that total, 14 clients, is exactly the same number that Todd Burleson got to the summit during that same period. And Krakauer's puffery continues when he describes Hall's safety record. Krakauer writes, with so many marginally qualified climbers flocking to Everest these days, a lot of people believed that a tragedy of this magnitude was overdue. But nobody imagined that an expedition led by Rob Hall would be at the center of it. Hall has the tightest, safest operation on the mountain, bar none. A compulsively methodical man, he had elaborate systems in place that were supposed to prevent such a catastrophe. So what happened? But this blatantly ignores Rob Hall abandoning a client, Lydia Brady, on Everest in 1988, and ignores the entirely foreseeable death of Rob Hall's partner in adventure consultants, Gary Ball. It also ignores this article in High Magazine from 1994, noting one of Rob Hall's clients, quote, had no serious mountaineering experience before this trip. And it also ignores the 1993 report from Elizabeth Hawley that blames Rob Hall's team for clogging up the Hillary Step. Krakauer does note that Gary Ball died on an adventure consultant's expedition to Dhaulagiri in 1993, but fails to mention the numerous problems that were ignored leading up to this. The following is from Ed Viester's No Shortcuts to the Top, recounting his 1992 climb of K2. Here, Rob Hall and Gary Ball turned around early, and they are met by Viesters and Fisher on the descent. Gary was slowly deteriorating, getting weaker and weaker, yet he was perfectly lucid. He knew exactly what was going on, since it had happened to him before. At last we reached the site of Camp 3. Here, we were at the upper end of the fixed ropes. Scott, Charlie, and I decided to go on down to Camp 2. We figured Rob could handle Gary on the fixed ropes. As it was, however, they had a fierce struggle and got into camp very late. By now, Gary was exhausted. We had to help him into his tent, and we brewed up hot chocolate for him and Rob. Unable to carry it, Gary had left his pack somewhere up above, so Scott and I gave him one of our sleeping bags. That night, the weather worsened. Scott and I huddled sleepless beneath our remaining bag. The tent half collapsed around us. So Gary Ball had experienced this same issue previously. It's not clear exactly when, and then he needed to be assisted down by Viesters and Fisher in 1992. And yet, the very next year, Hall and Ball are again attempting an 8,000-meter peak, this time Dhaulagiri, where Ball again suffered from cerebral edema, and this time perished. I will not examine that climb in detail, but the notion that Rob Hall was an overly cautious expedition leader is not supported by the record of his climbs. Also absent from Krakauer's account is the time Rob Hall ran out of oxygen on his descent of K2 in 1994. The following picks up in Sheer Will, where Michael Groom and Carlos Bueller had turned around sometime after 4:20 p.m., while Rob Hall pressed onto the summit extremely late in the day. As a note, Groom would make a second attempt later in this expedition and reach the summit. Also, there is some dispute as to whether Rob reached the actual summit of K2. Rob is not here to defend himself, so I will not explore that issue. The following is from Groom's first attempt, where he and Carlos turned around a short distance from the summit. When the angle of the slope eased, I sat down and waited for the others. It was 20 minutes before they appeared, and I discovered the reason for their slowness. Rob had run out of oxygen and had become very weak and tired. I was able to support him with his arm around my shoulder, and together we managed 20 to 30 meters before collapsing into the snow to rest. Carlos went on ahead of us, searching for our tent. With the light from the head torch fading, so came the urgency to find our tents as soon as possible. Groom goes on to describe how they got lost in the dark when they were trying to find their tents, when by pure luck, someone in their tent turned a light on at 1:45 a.m., and they were able to find their way back. Summiting far too late, running out of oxygen, and getting lost looking for the tents. Does any of this sound familiar? And speaking of similarities, on Everest in the fall of 1994, a client of Rob Hall's ran out of oxygen on the descent. That year, they left South Col about midnight and were on the summit shortly after 10 a.m. All clients were descending by 11:30 a.m. when the client, Wendell, was reported to have run out of gas. But this would only happen if Wendell was climbing third on the descent. We don't have the details of what happened, but we know Viesters escorted Wendell back to South Col at about 6 p.m. As Wendell had 3 oxygen bottles, 2 he carried and 1 placed on South Summit by a Sherpa, he should not have run out if he switched his bottle at South Summit on the ascent. It looks like he did not. Thus, Hall did not have an established safety record. Hall had a client get into a distressed situation in the fall of 1994 from what appears to be climbing third on the descent. Rather than fixing this problem, Rob Hall's member John Krakauer and Andy Harris would also be climbing third on the descent in 1996 with disastrous consequences. I cover that in the Third on the Descent video because the decision to instruct his guides and clients to climb third on the descent was made at base camp, well in advance of the climb. Rob Hall deliberately chose a risky option that had caused problems back in 1994. All of this is ignored in Into Thin Air, and Rob is presented as the safety-conscious guy that just happened to get caught out in a storm. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to cover every piece of Krakauer's bias. In part 2, we'll pick up and look at how the late decision to switch from Mountain Madness to Adventure Consultants caused Rob Hall to be stretched too thin on oxygen, and we'll look at what decisions this forced Rob Hall to make.